Apart from these three centres and those connected with them, we have two more centres, fully developed and properly functioning, but they are not connected with our usual life, nor with the three centres in which we are aware of ourselves. The existence of these higher centres in us is a greater riddle than the hidden treasures which men who believe in the existence of the mysterious and the miraculous have sought since the remotest times. All mystical and occult systems recognize the existence of higher forces and capacities in man, although in many cases they admit the existence of these forces and capacities only in the form of possibilities, and speak of the necessity for developing the hidden forces in man. This present teaching differs from many others by the fact that it affirms that the higher centres exist in man and are fully developed. It is the lower centres that are undeveloped, and it is precisely this lack of development or the incomplete functioning of the lower centres that prevents us from making use of the work of the higher centres. As has been said earlier, there are two higher centres. The higher emotional centre, working with hydrogen-12, and the higher thinking centre, working with hydrogen-6. If we consider the work of the human machine from the point of view of the hydrogens which work the centres, we shall see why the higher centres cannot be connected with the lower ones. The intellectual centre works with hydrogen-48, the moving centre with hydrogen-24. If the emotional centre were to work with hydrogen-12, its work would be connected with the work of the higher emotional centre. In those cases where the work of the emotional centre reaches the intensity and speed of existence which is given by hydrogen-12, a temporary connection with the higher emotional centre takes place, and man experiences new emotions, new impressions hitherto entirely unknown to him, for the description of which he has neither words nor expressions. But in ordinary conditions, the difference between the speed of our usual emotions and the speed of the higher emotional centre is so great that no connection can take place, and we fail to hear within us the voices which are speaking and calling to us from the higher emotional centre. The higher thinking centre, working with hydrogen-6, is still further removed from us, still less accessible. Connection with it is possible only through the higher emotional centre. It is only from descriptions of mystical experiences, ecstatic states, and so on, that we know cases of such connections. These states can occur on the basis of religious emotions, or, for short moments, through particular narcotics, or in certain pathological states such as epileptic fits or accidental traumatic injuries to the brain, in which cases it is difficult to say which is the cause and which is the effect, that is, whether the pathological state results from this connection or its cause. If we could connect the centres of our ordinary consciousness with the higher thinking centre deliberately and at will, it would be of no use to us whatever in our present general state. In most cases where accidental contact with the higher thinking centre takes place, a man becomes unconscious. The mind refuses to take in the flood of thoughts, emotions, images, and ideas which suddenly burst into it. And instead of a vivid thought or a vivid emotion, there results, on the contrary, a complete blank, a state of unconsciousness. The memory retains only the first moment when the flood rushed in on the mind, and the last moment when the flood was receding, and consciousness returned. But even these moments are so full of unusual shades and colours that there is nothing with which to compare them among the ordinary sensations of life. This is usually all that remains from so-called mystical and ecstatic experiences, which represent a temporary connection with a higher centre. Only very seldom does it happen that a mind which has been better prepared succeeds in grasping and remembering something of what was felt and understood at the moment of ecstasy. But even in these cases, the thinking, the moving, and the emotional centres remember and transmit everything in their own way, translate absolutely new and never previously experienced sensations into the language of usual everyday sensations, transmit in worldly three-dimensional form things which pass completely beyond the limits of worldly measurements. In this way, of course, they entirely distort every trace of what remains in the memory of those unusual experiences. Our ordinary centres, in transmitting the impressions of the higher centres, may be compared to a blind man speaking of colours, or to a deaf man speaking of music. In order to obtain a correct and permanent connection between the lower and the higher centres, it is necessary to regulate and quicken the work of the lower centres. What is called, according to one terminology, the astral body, is called in another terminology the higher emotional centre, although the difference here does not lie in the terminology alone. These are, so to speak, more correctly different aspects of the next stage of man's evolution. It can be said that the astral body is necessary for the complete and proper functioning of the higher emotional centre in unison with the lower. Or it can be said that the higher emotional centre is necessary for the work of the astral body. The mental body corresponds to the higher thinking centre. It would be wrong to say that they are one and the same thing, but one requires the other. One cannot exist without the other. One is the expression of certain sides and functions of the other. The fourth body requires the complete and harmonious working of all centres, and it implies or is the expression of complete control over this working. What is necessary to understand, and what the table of hydrogens helps us to grasp, is the idea of the complete materiality of all the psychic, intellectual, emotional, volitional, and other inner processes, including the most exalted poetic inspirations, religious ecstasies, and mystical revelations.